This is The Sweater with Kathleen Dames. Over our 12-episode season, I will share some of my best sweater knitting techniques with you while we knit a sweater together. Hello, my friends. Today we are going to talk about yarn because this is season 4, episode 2. Yes, 2 of The Sweater. So we're going to talk about yarn today. We're going to talk about fiber content, spin, weight, thickness, grist, all those words that are really just talking about yarn. And I should say that I am using, or I used on the original in wreath pullover, I used Bichet Bouche Le Petit Lambswool, which is categorized as a light fingering weight yarn. And light and fingering are thickness terms in this context. I'm using like US terms for yarn. In Australia and New Zealand, I believe they use ply to indicate thickness. And ply can indicate thickness, but and certainly the way they use it, so like a 12 ply is 12 plies of yarn, that's pretty thick. And so a 2 ply might be a fingering weight. But the yarn I'm going to use for my new design is a multiply, multiple plies, more plies than Bichet Bouche, which has basically 2 plies. And that's 2 strands of yarn spun together. And so you have single ply yarn. And a lot of times these days you'll find single ply fingering weight yarn. And those are great for certain things. But the more plies you add, the stronger it gets. And it's just kind of like a fun fact about yarn. When you have just 1 ply, it's easier to pull apart. If you've ever tried to spin yarn or you've seen someone with pencil roving or any kind of roving, when those fibers are just together, it's easier to kind of pull them apart. Once you start taking multiple strands and twisting them together, they reinforce each other, they strengthen each other. And that's part of what's going on with plies. The yarn I'm going to be using, I've got 2 here. Yes, of course it's 2, and I'm using actually 2. These are 2 different yarns, completely different. Whereas in wreath, used 2 different colors of the same yarn. So I'm using this yarn from Swans Island. It has a little bit of alpaca blended into it, and I think that gives it pretty much its color. I think it's undyed, and it has, I think it has 2, it might have 3 plies to it. And then this wonderful neon is from Monostel Uruguay, and it is their Fino yarn, and it has multiple plies. How many? Let's see if I can figure that out. I am sort of teasing apart the end of my skein, and it looks like 2, but it might be 3. And it's the plies themselves are pretty twisted to begin with, and then they're twisted together, and that adds strength. That also, I'm not a spinner. I know there's more going on, so if you are interested in more about the spin of yarn than I get to today, I'll see if I can find some resources for you. But there are definitely good spinners out there. Search up, spinning on Instagram or YouTube, and I'm sure you'll come up with a bunch of good stuff. So we've got the yarn thickness, which is what I started to talk about. And in the US, it ranges from 0 to like 5, which is lace weight, to bulky, I think. And I think it goes up from there, but I tend to be more in the lighter weight range. I live in New York City. Our apartments are all pretty overheated, and I don't need thick, heavy sweaters. I don't wear them very often, except when it's really, really cold, or if I know I'm going to be outside for a long time. But I tend to knit thinner weight sweaters that I can wear more of the year and not get sweaty. So we've got our thickness, and we've got a little bit we talked about plies and about those being spun together, but we haven't talked about actual spin of yarn and how the difference between these two, between the yarn I used for enwreathed and the yarn I'm using for the next pullover, is the way that the fiber was prepared to be spun. So biche bouche, the Le Petit Lamb's wool, is a woolen spun yarn. And then this other, the Manos and the Swan's Island that I'm using, and most fingering plied yarns, most sock yarns that you see that you might be using, they will be worsted spun. And when you prepare fiber to be spun in a worsted way, you brush it or you comb it. You might have seen those flicker combs. They look like big cat or dog brushes, and you brush them together and you lay the fiber on there and you brush it out, you comb it out, you lay all the fibers in the same direction. And that tends to, I think, give you a little more sheen. Everything is working together, and the twist, and they can get tighter together. It tends to be, I don't want to say robust, but the yarn tends to be more solid, and then which can be great, especially for socks. There's no judgment here. These are just different ways to prepare the fiber, and you get different results. That's the thing to keep in mind when you are looking at yarn for your sweater or for any knit. Then for enwreathed with the Petit Lamb's wool, that is woolen spun. It's hard because they both start with a W, and I do sometimes have to pause and think, even when I know that I'm going to be talking about this stuff, which term I actually mean. So, worsted spun, smooth, shiny, bouncy. Woolen spun, jumbled. The fibers aren't all coaxed into the same direction. They are just kind of fluffed together, and it lends a very different quality to the yarn. Where did my little ball go? There it is. Of course, I have this really wonderful dark navy, so it's really hard to see. But if you go to a yarn shop and you ask them, they should be able to direct you to some woolen spun yarn, and you can see the difference. It tends to be more matte. This is a little more bumpy. And the funny thing is, in those bumps, there's air. And that's one of the charming things about this yarn, at least for me. This sweater is as light as air. It is like fluffy. It practically can float away. The yarn is held together more loosely. If you pull at it, it will break apart more easily. Let's see. I will show you. So this is the Petit Lamb's wool, and I've wrapped it once around each finger on each hand, and I'm going to pull, and it just kind of pulls apart, and they're fibers. It's really easy to spit slice. Because the fibers are just jumbled up to begin with, spit slicing, you're just kind of jumbling and mashing them together more and mashing them together firmly. Whereas I'll now break off a little piece of this Manos, and same thing. I'm not pulling it too tight, but that took a lot more effort. Okay, I probably could spit splice this, maybe not. I think this is superwash, so that would be harder to do. You do not find superwash woolen spun yarn. So that's something to keep in mind. You need to know yourself what kind of care you or the person you're making your sweater for are going to be able to handle. So this woolen spun is a little more delicate. I mean, even I could just pull it apart. If you're a tight knitter, you may not want to go with woolen spun because the fibers are just not working together as tightly as worsted spun yarn. Especially if you are a tight knitter, you may want to be looking at fingering weight yarn that really is sock yarn, that has some nylon in it, that will give it strength. Because I have done this, I am a loose knitter. We've talked about this in past seasons. We're going to talk about it a little bit more. Next time we're going to talk about gauge and needles. But I will say, as a loose knitter, even I have broken some worsted spun yarn, usually on cables. And it's really frustrating, and part of it is being mindful of what you're doing. And so if you're a tight knitter, be mindful of that, know that that is who you are, and try and choose yarn accordingly. The other thing is, if you have fallen in love with this yarn and you really want to use it, consider just slowing down. But it's hard, I find. You slow down, your gauge can change, like lots of things change. So I think it's just best, as we said last time when choosing size, thinking about the sweater you're going to knit, again, you need to know yourself and you need to be honest with yourself, and you need to make sure you choose yarn that you can work with easily. So, excuse me, I'm sorry. That is, that's again my general know thyself lecture. So we'll have lots of those. Okay, so the next thing we need to talk about is the fiber content of your yarn. And enwreathed, Le Petit Lamb's wool is just wool. 100% not treated for superwashness or anything. And that's something you want to think about, how you or the person you're knitting this for is going to take care of it. So if you know that someone is not going to hand wash, lay flat to dry, pat nicely, whatever, you may want to focus more on superwash or a cotton blend or something that is definitely going to be easier to take care of. This worsted spun light fingering weight lamb's wool is delicate. It felts easily. It's great for spit splicing. It's great once it's all knit together. It makes this wonderful cohesive fabric. But you have to be careful. Do not throw this in the washing machine. That is just going to, it'll break your heart, and you don't want that. We work too hard on our knits to have them get ruined. So if you know that you're not the kind of person who can take care of it and gently wash it and make sure it doesn't felt, then choose a different yarn. Now, for the new design that I am working on while you are knitting and wreathed, I am using this blend from Swan's Island. It is 85% merino and 15% alpaca. And because I know that, I'm gonna, alpaca, I'm taking advantage of its drape. Alpaca as a fiber is, it's a long hollow tube. Each piece of alpaca fiber is a long hollow tube, and the heat from your body warms up the air inside that tube, and that's what keeps it warm. Pretty cool. Those tubes also mean that the yarn, the fiber cannot be jumbled up. It's smooth and straight, and alpaca has great drape as a result. And drape, it just means the way it lays and it hangs, and you have to be careful because 100% alpaca will hang and hang. It's known to grow. So that's just something to know about for what you're working on. So I will have the bounce of the merino and sort of shine, and then a little bit of drape from the alpaca. And then the other yarn is it's 100% merino. You can also look at other kinds of blends. There are all kinds of blends out there, especially in fingering weight yarn, because a lot of times fingering weight is used for socks. So you may find yarn that is blended with nylon for strength. Nylon is a very long monofilament that is harder to, if you've ever bought any squeaky acrylic or nylon yarn, you know that you can't really break it with your hands because those long strands are really hard to break. So that's great for socks. It sort of allows the wool to be around the nylon. So that gives strength. Other natural fibers that can provide strength include something like mohair. Mohair is different from alpaca. It's got a little more crinkle to it usually, but the fibers are long and strong and shiny. So sometimes you'll see a blend with mohair in it, and it's not quite like the mohair of a kid silk haze or anything. It's usually longer, more mature mohair, and again, it's those long fibers, and so those are great for strength and stability. Cashmere, of course, is super soft, tiny, thin fibers that are magically warm and soft. They don't have a lot of strength. They don't have bounce. So cashmere is again going to have a sort of drape and a soft halo, not as drapey as alpaca. They twinkle. Cashmere fibers, they sort of, that's the halo. It's the sort of twinkle of fibers. So, you need to think about what makes sense for you, for what you want your sweater to look like. And the gauge on Enwreathed is, I want to say, it's like 6 stitches to the inch for the stockinette portion, and then more like 6.5 to 7, I think. It's been a while since I wrote the pattern, but it's a pretty forgiving gauge. So you could probably even go up to a sport weight to get back to weight of yarn, and still get gauge. It will give you a thicker fabric, which may be what you want. So you need to think about, I love this sweater. The gauge is fairly open. And in fact, in the pine boughs, you can sometimes see a little of the contrast color coming through the main color. Not when it's worn usually, but here on the mannequin, I notice it in a couple places. The stitches are not very close together. I am actually working at a tighter gauge for the new design here, so that those stitches will be close together. They'll be smaller. I'm working on a US 2 instead of a US 4, and I felt that was a better fabric. So this is season 4 of The Sweater with Kathleen Dames, and we are knitting the Enwreathed pullover together. Many thanks to Bichet Bouche, Swans Island, and Monostit Uruguay for making such delicious yarns, and to Brooklyn General, Nitty City, and Swans Island Company for selling those yarns to me. Many thanks to my technical editor, my test knitter, and to you for being part of The Sweater with Kathleen Dames. To purchase the Enwreathed pullover and or cowl pattern, visit kathleensdames.com/thesweater or find it on Ravelry. Remember that you get a copy of the cowl pattern if you purchase the pullover. While you're there, be sure to sign up for my newsletter so you won't miss an episode. Plus, you can always hit reply on a newsletter and ask me any questions that come up about sweater knitting. Posting your progress on social media? Be sure to use the hashtags Enwreathed Pullover and Enwreathed Cowl and tag me at Kathleen Dames. If you have a chance, be sure to rate and review on iTunes, even if you watch the YouTube version of this podcast. Thanks so much for being here, and happy knitting!